The young lady sat in the garden and frantically gazed at the beautiful flowers with her maid. The little girl said she found a transparent flower. The maid looked at the lovely flower and said it could be plucked and put in the girl's room, so that she may enjoy his beauty to the full. The young lady looked at him and said she already had a lot of great things, so much so that it would be a shame for her to blow it up out of greed. She sincerely didn't want to destroy such a lovely flower. She wanted to enjoy its beauty in the garden. The maid looked at her and thought she was a very sweet girl. She later said that the flower fairy would have been touched by her words. She admired the little lady's kindness. Unexpectedly for the young lady, an unusual glow appeared near the flower. Sweet Princess Isabelle was very excited about the glowing ball of light that was headed straight for her hands. She didn't understand what was happening, but she loved the soft glow coming from the beautiful flower. The man was screaming frantically and calling for his wife. She hurriedly ran to him. The man was expecting a very important guest to come to him, and his wife did not even deign to prepare for the arrival of the guest. The young lady said she had heard that the guest would be closer to sundown, so she decided to get to work in the garden. The man was angry, for she thought that in other kingdoms princesses might tend the garden, but in his empire, he was sure that such work was for a gardener, not for an earl's wife. Isabelle was very upset, since she knew her husband wasn't going to hire a gardener, and she felt sorry that no one was looking after the garden. She wanted to be useful and look after the corner of her happiness. She loved spending her time in the garden. The small island country is surrounded by the sea. The kingdom of Rune, a place that was always filled with the vibrant energy of the residents and the smiles of children. The streets were very peaceful. However, this world disappeared with the invasion of the Eternity Empire. The king of Run Lake, who couldn't see the smell of blood, experienced great bewilderment from this invasion, and it could only be considered lucky that the emperor's last mercy, if they obediently admitted defeat, there would be no more casualties among the people of Run Kingdom. Prince Nadal was to join the Imperial Order of Chivalry, and Princess Isabelle was to be betrothed to a noble lord chosen by the emperor. The prince and princess wasted no time in thinking and accepted the offer. As promised, the people of the Rune Kingdom no longer shed their blood. Isabelle wallowed in her thoughts. It was her husband who pulled her out of her thoughts. He began to shout as he was displeased that she was not listening to him and the Marquis. He regarded her inattention as an insult to the guest. Marquis provided information related to the Moonstone Treaty. He provided her with a scroll and asked her to read it for her opinion. He wanted to know her opinion, and he also wanted to test the princess on her knowledge. The girl was confused, as the language of the kingdom and the empire sounds the same, but differs in writing. She had already lived in the earl's house for a year, but had never seen a simple home teacher to help her with her writing studies. And all the text the girl saw was very difficult for her, since he had only terms. Isabelle looked at it and realized that it said that the Ballon mine was producing far fewer moonstones than planned. She was satisfied that she could understand the context. She didn't want to show her weaknesses in front of her guest and her husband. Marquis looked at her and nodded in agreement. Unfortunately, they could not have foreseen this situation at the time of contracting, so he would like to correct the information somewhat, but first he would like to hear the opinions of those present. He said there were items written at the bottom for correction, and he wanted her to read them. The young girl was very surprised as she saw only professional terms and could not understand what it said. She had a very hard time concentrating and understanding what was written. The man looked at the confused girl with a satisfied smirk and apologized. He said that the Countess seemed to have difficulty reading imperial writing. He was glad he could humiliate her in this way. After the evening meal, there was an altercation between the couple. The man was furious with his spouse. The man felt that his spouse had made him look unseemly. He was yelling and throwing things at her. Young Isabelle was shocked at her spouse's reaction. When he threw various objects at her, he injured her. The girl stood confused and blood ran down her cheek. She thought every day about how she could escape from the manor. Isabelle trembled, but she couldn't help it. Isabelle knew that if only she wasn't the princess of the kingdom, and if only she hadn't made a promise to the emperor, she would have been able to escape. But unfortunately, she had no choice. She had to endure all the torment and abuse from her husband. The girl looked at herself in the mirror and realized that her wound on her cheek had become very rough. She knew she would be scarred for the rest of her life. The Count would not send her outside, and gradually she became a recluse herself. Since I didn't want to show my ugly face to anyone, the Count received the letter and laughed furiously over its contents. Isabelle was puzzled and asked what was wrong. He grinned at her and told her that her own brother had died on the battlefield. It amused him that he could easily hurt her. Young Isabelle could not believe his words. She was furious and screamed that her brother couldn't die so easily. The Count was confused and bewildered. He didn't understand how a woman who couldn't even read well could raise her voice at him. Her behavior brought him shock, which turned into anger toward her. The girl was shocked at his words. The Count was angry with her and didn't understand how she dared to look at him like that. He knew she was hurt that he was treating her like this, but he liked treating her that way. The girl, in a deep bow and with tears in her eyes, frantically begged the Count to tell her where her brother's body had been sent. The Count looked at her scornfully and said he would tell her nothing. The Count looked at his wife and said that she was born a princess, and she was sad and hurt, but she should still look at everything with gratitude. He didn't know what good it did her, he thought, and good treatment was an excess of generosity towards her. While the husband was yelling at his wife, she heard a voice in her head. The girl was overcome with fear. She didn't realize what was going on. She was scared and in pain. Her heart was breaking at the mere thought of losing her brother forever. The Count was shocked and shouted at her not to dare faking illness, since he won't believe her. He didn't like unnecessary pretense. Poor Isabelle cried out mentally that she missed, for her father and mother. She frantically wanted to go back to a time when there was peace and tranquility. As suddenly by magic, a voice in her head said, "Get rid of everyone who was hurting her." And in an instant her husband was gone. She never saw her husband again. The young girl woke up and screamed furiously. The maid walked over to her and began to calm her down. The young lady rushed to her maid. She was trembling and crying. The maid kept calming her down. She wished to comfort the frightened child. The maid calmed the girl down and told her everything would be fine. She didn't understand her frustrated feelings. She lovingly and warmly asked why Isabelle was trembling so much. Rita was a kind nurse whom young Isabelle missed very much. Young Isabelle looked out of the window. After all, every day she gazed out the window at her empire, until another empire joined them. It saddened her, the way things had turned out. She looked at her reflection of her face and was puzzled since it didn't have a scar on it yet. She didn't know what had happened, but she was very glad she had found herself in this place. After everything the girl had seen and learned, she felt dizzy. She lost consciousness and fell to the floor. Soon the young princess was visited by her father. He was very worried about the girl. Isabelle was very glad to see him. She threw herself into his arms in tears. The man was puzzled. He didn't understand what could have frightened his daughter so much. A moment later, her brother entered their room. He was very worried about his sister. For a moment, the girl remembered her husband's words about her brother being dead. She was very happy to see him and ran up to her brother at full steam. She was very glad he was okay. The girl wasn't shy about her emotions. She ran up to him and hugged her brother. He was a little confused. Isabelle frantically begged her brother to forgive her for everything. The young man didn't understand what had happened to his sister. "Master, ask the nurse to take care of Isabelle." Rita told her master that she would be sure to take care of his daughter as well, and he could worry about nothing. After all, she loved the girl like her own, and wanted to do everything she could for her. The nurse and the princess were left alone in the room. Rita asked the young girl how she was feeling, and offered her some soup to nibble on. The young princess was very happy to be able to taste the soup from her childhood. She was very pleased and thanked her provider. After all, for a moment she was able to return to a carefree childhood. After the meal, Rita asked the young princess what dreams she had had and if she could tell her. Rita genuinely wanted to help the girl. She wanted to help the girl and relieve her sorrow and grief. Isabelle hesitated, but nevertheless proceeded with the story. The story took a while to tell, but still Isabelle gradually recounted her nightmare to Rita. The young princess was a little upset and asked the nurse if she believed her or not. Telling the dream, it was as if the girl was going back in time. For a moment she thought everything was a complete delusion. Rita looked at her and said in an affectionate voice that she would believe anything the girl said. She knew it was all true, just as she knew that the princess had been born on a warm spring day, and when the princess first cried, there was a breeze from the flower petals that permeated the room as if dancing. It was very amazing and truly a beautiful sight. It seemed as if the flowers were congratulating the birth of a princess. Isabelle looked at Rita and said she didn't deserve to be treated like that. The nurse in turn took the girl's hand and told her that she was loved by everyone and asked her not to forget it. Young Isabelle was very touched by the words of the maid. She thanked her for her warmth and care. Rita looked at her princess and said that a fairy must have helped her. She didn't know if it was a dream or the coming future, but either way she was back from that horrible place. She didn't want to live that nightmare anymore. Young Isabelle wanted to forget it all as soon as possible. A distressed Isabelle heard all the words through a veil of tears, so she didn't remember thoroughly, but she was sure she had heard some of the words. She didn't know if it was the fairy or someone else, but it came back from that place. So she prayed and asked that her future would not happen again in such a horrible way. But the quiet days didn't last long. A servant burst into the study where Isabelle and her father were. He said he had urgent reports. The servant was very excited and frightened. The man said the Eternity Empire had declared war on them. Hearing this, Isabelle faded. Her world turned upside down. She knew the same fate awaited her. Dark clouds of chaos loomed over the small kingdom that had always been peaceful. It was hard for the young prince to look at the serious expression on his father's face. He knew he would have to join the Empire's Order of Knights. Young Isabelle knew she was to marry an imperial nobleman, and the people of the kingdom would no longer have to shed their blood. She wished she could tell her father what she knew, for she remembered all the terms. But she couldn't say anything. Soon her brother joined the Empire's Order of Knights, and she knew she would marry an aristocrat from the Empire. But unfortunately, it was the way of grief and misery, not of universal salvation. She knew she had to prevent such a future, but she was at a loss and confused because she didn't know what to do or how to act. Young Isabelle wanted to try to change her father's mind, but unfortunately, it didn't work out. Everything she tried didn't work, and time was wasted. The young girl knew she had 1 month left, and she knew she had to make a change. Hovering in her thoughts, she accidentally bumped into a young boy. Seeing him, the girl was a little embarrassed as it was the first time she had seen him. She didn't understand why the imperial personage was leaving the audience hall. He saw the look in her eyes and jokingly said that you could clearly tell from her gaze what she was thinking and what question she was interested in, namely that the imperial faces were forgotten here. After an awkward pause, the man said that he had come specifically to see the young princess. The girl was a little excited and surprised at being wanted. She didn't know what the young man wanted her to say, but she knew she had to change her future. She looked at him and asked how he could help her. She frantically wanted to hear all the information from him. The man looked at her with a smile and said he would definitely tell her everything, only they needed to go somewhere else. With one wave of his hand, he carried them to the roof. The girl was shocked by this, as she didn't expect such magic. The man only smiled and told her to be careful, as she might fall off the roof. Isabelle was frightened. She didn't understand how they could have moved to the roof. The man smiled and said he never introduced himself to her. He said his name was Oz. The man held a position as a professor at Kavala Academy. Kavala Academy is an educational institution located in the capital city of the Eternity Empire. She is known for students with outstanding abilities, including flight. The young professor looked at Princess Isabelle and suggested that she come with him to the academy. The girl was puzzled by his words, as she had heard that only gifted students could get there. The man said that he actually came to her, and because of the huge mana flow. It was from her that the flow was coming. Oz thought the girl was full of talent. Young Isabelle was shocked, as she didn't expect to have any powers. She had heard that the Emperor himself bestows a title on graduates of the academy. She was confused, as she could change her future after all. The girl was very pleased by his words, but also horrified, since she knew she had to marry, and also that she was not among the people of the Empire. She was confused and didn't understand why he was inviting her to join the academy. Despite all the nuances, the professor looked at the young talent and said that His Majesty valued talent very much, And if there was one, the girl would definitely be recommended and enrolled in the academy regardless of her status and background. The professor looked at the young lady and said that she definitely had talent, and the only question was whether she wanted to join the academy or not. The girl blossomed in front of her eyes. She said that she really wanted to join the academy. She knew that by doing so, she could change her future and her family's future herself. The professor was very happy with her decision and said that he himself would personally recommend her to the academy. The young princess was overjoyed, but she was also curious as to why he wanted her to join the academy. The man hesitated, but a moment later he said that there was someone who really wanted to see her, but he couldn't say anything else. He bowed and left her. The professor brought the girl back to the castle. Isabelle was surprised. As soon as she went down to the room, she was seen by her father. The man was confused. He didn't understand what had happened to her. Isabelle reassured him and told him it was okay. The man apologized to his daughter for neglecting her lately, as he has been busy with state affairs. 3 months later, the academy's entrance ceremony took place. All the young students were whispering, and were very excited about joining the academy. The young men whispered frantically as they knew they would be entering with His Majesty, the second prince of the Internet Empire, Chris Eternity. Young Isabelle approached the young man and asked if it was free near him. The young man was surprised, but said with a smile that she could sit down beside him. The girl thanked the young man. The young prince looked at the girl. They didn't speak. But all the aristocrats always wanted to talk to him. They tried to make a connection with him during admission, to line up with him. But the young princess spoke to him before the ceremony even began. He looked at her and realized that she was an unusual person at all. The prince assumed she wasn't because of the high nobility. The young prince thought the girl was hooked on him because of his family. He knew that if she spoke to him, he would have to answer. Young Isabelle said nothing and looked at the papers in silence. He didn't understand why she was still silent, since it had been about half an hour and she hadn't even tried to talk to him. Young Isabelle sat studying the admissions manual. The prince looked at her and realized she was trying to get attention, but not in the same way as everyone else. One of the heads of the academy congratulated the students on their enrollment. The young Prince of Temptation looked out and glared at the girl. She definitely interested him. The prince forbade himself to look at her and pay close attention. The woman said that this year, the doors of the academy were not only open to applicants from the empire, but also to many talented people quite from all over the continent. She enjoyed introducing the 2 people who were honored to receive the certificates. Everyone sat in anticipation and didn't know who was going to be named. The young prince was in anticipation of having his name called. He knew he needed to get up and greet the crowd. But the head of the academy called Isabelle's name as they wanted to welcome her. The young beauty Isabelle went in a hurry to the leader, and the astonished prince stood gazing after her. Isabelle was presented with a certificate of merit. She was overjoyed as she had worked hard. Bring was also given a certificate of merit. He knew that even if he didn't try to labor, he would have everything he wanted. He didn't even doubt that it would continue. But when he saw the silver certificate for second place, he was beyond excited. The prince noticed Isabelle. Their gazes crossed. He was glad of this, as the girl had simply not noticed him before. But suddenly, unexpectedly, the girl turned around and walked away. He was shocked and didn't realize what had happened. In the morning came a letter from Isabelle. The young princess was writing a letter after finishing the entrance ceremony. Since she was enrolled in the academy as a top student due to her hard work, and she immediately wanted to share this news with her brother. The girl also wrote about her experiences. The young princess was very afraid of the coming future, but she knew she could quite manage as well. The young one especially wanted to know how her brother was doing, as well as her father. Isabelle sincerely hoped that her brother always put his safety first. She prayed fervently for his health every day. Isabelle was the child who became her brother's raison d'être after her mother's death. Their mother died of a serious illness just a few years after their birth. Before she died, she begged her son to watch over his sister. The young man wanted to make her happy and protect her from all adversity. So when his sister talked about studying abroad, he was both surprised and concerned, as the girl was given a difficult job. The young man was genuinely proud of his sister, as she was now the academy's top student. He knew their mom would be very happy for her. The young man was called to morning practice. He left the letter in a hurry and went to practice. Along the way, he kept thinking about his sister. He didn't want her to suffer and hoped to do everything he could to make sure she lived a good life. The young man knew he would soon be a true knight and could protect her. The young prince sat in the library studying books. But beyond that, he thought of the young red-haired beauty who had overtaken him in his studies. The girl slipped as she didn't expect it to be very slippery. She thought there was something wrong with the floor cleaner. The young prince froze. He could not answer anything. Young Isabelle not only got better, but also earned a spot in the admissions competition, and she received the best education from the most famous professors, and she also learned the right way out of difficult positions and unclear situations. The young prince thought that perhaps the Rune Kingdom had special methods for cultivating talented people. He frantically wanted to find all the information he could about the girl. The young prince's musings were interrupted by the arrival of a young man. The one looked at the prince with a smile and said that he was sitting in the library behind books, not even having time to enter the academy. The prince grinned at him and told him that if the man wasn't an old friend to him, he would already be in custody for being disrespectful to him. The young man thanked the prince for his display. The prince was puzzled as the young man came into the library, without attending the ceremony itself. The young man said the library is the quietest place. Esar is the owner of the tower and the only son of the great warlock of the empire. He is also a freshman who attracts enough attention to be friends with the prince. Unfortunately, the young man was almost forced into the academy, and so he was always ready to run away. The prince was a bit frustrated as he knew the class distribution, and they were in different classes. The prince said the young man is in the lowest class. What the young man noticed was that the prince seemed to have taken a liking to the young red-haired princess. Esar was preoccupied with the fact that they could be together. He thought it was pretty interesting. The prince was furious. He didn't understand where he got this information from if he wasn't even at the ceremony. The young man said that he had his own sources of information, and especially the prince he knew did not like to study, much less read about all sorts of backwater states. The upset prince said that the girl was the best in the class, and he came in second place. That's why he got curious. Isabelle had memorized her entire schedule and the location of the rooms in the building. She also packed everything she needed for class. She knew it was time for her to get ready for class. The young lady turned around to see the prince surrounded by his classmates. They smiled and asked if he had chosen his elective. He was talking to everyone with a smile. He said he was still thinking about electives. Isabelle stared at the young prince for a moment. She thought he was like he was from another world. In her past life, Isabelle once saw a second prince. He was very different then from the man she sees now. Among the imperial family, it was the second prince that her husband the count hated. According to the count, he was a very calculating man and equally careless, capable of throwing away everything and everyone whom he deemed useless, and in opposition to what was said, all others considered him an ideal, who by his mere presence lighted up everything around him. Isabelle remembered the cold stare that touched one incapable of forgiving the slightest oversight. That look was still in her memory, but now she was seeing a completely different person. She didn't understand how the current prince was different from the past. She didn't know if her husband had lied or if it was all true, but she knew that something would change him in the future. Isabelle decided not to think about anything and focus on her studies, as her goal was to become a top graduate. Isabelle was greeted by her class teacher and a professor of applied magic. He inquired about her progress and also decided to test the young girl's knowledge. The young princess answered all the questions of the teacher with ease, and he was very pleased with her knowledge. When the princess learned that her supervisor would be Professor Oz, she was overjoyed, since I was able to meet a familiar face at the academy. Applied magic was not an exact science, so the subject serves those without magical abilities, and since it was very complicated, she was quite diligent in learning it. The professor said that magic is equal to cooking, since the basis of the latter is ingredients. The magic formula is a kind of ingredient. If you take the right ingredients, you can move on to the main process. The professor asked Isabelle questions. After a few correct answers, the girl faltered and didn't know the answer to the last question. A young man came up to them and answered in her place, after which he sat down at his desk and said that everyone said she was the best student. He was very happy that the girl had overtaken the prince himself, and with a smirk asked if she liked the prince. Their awkward conversation was disturbed by the professor. He said there was no place for extraneous conversations during class. The professor was sure that a casual greeting at lunch or during a break would have sufficed. The professor asked the young man if he wanted to listen to a lecture or if he would prefer something else. Esar said in a frustrated voice that he would listen to the lecture. The professor was pleased. Young Isabelle didn't understand why the boy was acting so strangely, or why he was interacting with the professor in such a way. She looked at him. The white hair and red eyes stood out, and it was hard to take your eyes off the boy who looked like a rabbit. Esar looked at the red-haired princess and said that she was very cute. Isabelle was puzzled. She said she was going to go to lunch. The young man looked at her and said they could go together. Isabelle was on her way to lunch with a new friend and was confused as none of the out-of-state natives approached her first. In their class, all eyes were on the young prince, and as the best student, she could only be asked for class materials. So wherever Isabelle went, whether it was to class or lunch or to the library, she was always alone. Esar said the professor has a talent for complicating simple things, so he's not very popular. Isabelle was a little surprised and said that she thought the professor was very much the popular one, as the girls followed him in droves. The young man grinned at her and said that everyone in his classes were like sleepy flies, but noticed that it certainly wasn't about them. Isabelle asked her friend how he knew her. She realized that he had learned all the information about her beforehand. Unexpectedly, a prince approached them. Young Isabelle was frightened at such an unexpected appearance. The results of the study showed that there are no special methods of nurturing talented people in the kingdom. The more the prince delved deeper, the more convinced he became that the young princess came from a very small and weak country. However, after a few days of being in the same class, the prince realized that she was different from the other children to know, and he finally knew the answer to his question. Most children walked all the time on the path already paved. Their families went to the academy to spend time easily and carefree, but the young lady did not pay attention to the status and did not flatter anyone. Isabelle at times faced a difficult task, but would not leave her occupation until she had accomplished it. But some students even whispered that she had won first place through some trickery. But the prince knew there was no such thing. The girl tried harder than anyone. The prince was flying in the clouds the entire time, as he was far outside the academy with his thoughts. He kept thinking of the young princess as his thoughts were suddenly interrupted by his friend. He wanted to know if the prince had chosen the basics of swordsmanship as his faculty. The young man was very happy that the prince would join the swordsmanship club, as the first prince had once studied at the academy as well. The prince was born and raised by an imperial family, so a certain skill he already has. Fencing, he chose this department out of a desire to get the highest grade possible, while still having good grades even if he counted crows in class. The princess chose applied magic as her faculty, but unfortunately it was an infamous subject that everyone avoided. There were no wizards in her kingdom, so it would be very difficult for her due to her lack of skills and information. But Isabelle didn't want to give up and wasn't going to avoid the challenges. Principal was born the son of the emperor himself, so he studied swordsmanship from the age of 6. He knew he would do well if he took fencing lessons, but he had always been told that in order to become an outstanding emperor, one must not train one's strengths, but get rid of one's weaknesses. The fencing teacher said that if he likes fencing classes, but the young prince didn't have time to let the teacher finish his sentence and said that the sword had always been a part of him and his life, so he would like to challenge something new. When considering his application for faculty selection, the young prince chose the subject of applied magic. He's a little confused, as there are a lot of easy and fun things to do at the academy. He decided not to give up, as there was nothing that could scare him. But he knew he couldn't just run away. He wanted a fair fight for the honorable first place. Isabelle saw the prince and was surprised. Her new blonde friend looked at the prince with a surprised look. He didn't understand what drove him to study such a difficult subject. The principal was puzzled and had not expected to see his old friend beside Isabelle. Isabelle was sitting there eating her sandwich as a friend. Her new friend came up to her and said he wanted to try it too. The girl briefly broke the sandwich in half and gave the other half to her friend. The prince was surprised and didn't realize when they had become so close. Isabelle was surprised at such a question and said they were taking the same classes. The prince said they take classes in applied magic. Isabelle was surprised and asked how he knew they were dedicating that particular subject. The prince smiled and said she was the best student and would choose the most difficult subject. The prince smiled and said that it was very good that the girl had chosen such a subject, as he had also chosen this course. The young men were perplexed and did not understand why the prince had chosen to study such a difficult subject. The young man knew that knights had only held a sword in their hands all their lives and did not choose magic. He was perplexed by the prince's act. The prince said with a smile that it is the professors, and his academic discipline is also honored by the imperial family. So it would be a waste of time to go all the way to the academy and not be in the classes of a famous professor. Chris looked at Isabelle and asked to be addressed without formality. Since he's in the academy, he wasn't a prince, but only an ordinary student. The professor was very happy to have the second prince of the empire, the only son of the empire's great wizard, and the best student among the academy's freshmen in his class. The professor looked at Isabelle's completed work and said that she had no trouble finding the missing part of the formula. He asked her if she remembered what he had said. Isabelle was a little nervous, but mentally told herself to calm down and she would make it work. Isabelle knew she could do it, and she just needed to focus. Isabelle concentrated and set about the task at hand. The professor looked at her and said that she had done well and had summoned a cute rabbit. He claimed that the magic of creating something out of nothing was still impossible for her, but the summoning magic she used was quite different. The professor smilingly congratulated the young lady on her success. He looked at her and asked if she would take the little rabbit with her. Isabelle said she'd pick it up. Esar said moments like that made him reluctant to attend Oz's class. The young prince said he might as well not listen to him at all. He wondered what kind of magic could make Esar sit quietly in class. Esar was a bit surprised and asked the prince what brought him to magic lessons, since he was sure the prince was not interested in them. Young Isabelle interrupted their conversation and thanked Esar. She said he gave her a pep talk before she cast the spell correctly. Esar looked at her and realized that she was very nervous then. He knew that if she worried further, it wouldn't lead to anything good. And besides, he cared about something. He knew that a normal mage would just use mana. A mage of the highest ranks can sense it, and a great enchanter is able to see it with his own eyes. Even though he was the son of a great enchanter and could see mana himself as a child, but this was the first time he had seen the mana of the red flower. Mana obtained from the energy of the world tree is usually blue in color, in the books, although very rarely, but still mentioned the existence of red mana. But in reality, he had only encountered blue. Even the Grand Enchanter had blue mana, but Isabelle had red for some reason. Isabelle called out to the young man, breaking him from his musings. The girl said she had his image frozen in her mind, and she thought it made such an adorable bunny. Isabelle showed the rabbit closer to Esar. He was surprised. Isabelle was overjoyed and said with a smile that the rabbit looked very much like a young boy. The young men were puzzled. The prince did not understand how a rabbit could be like Esar. Isabelle said they look very similar as the rabbit is white and has red eyes. The prince laughed fiercely and said that the rabbit did indeed resemble white and red. Esar was puzzled. He didn't understand why he was compared to a rabbit, because he believed that if his image were true, it would have to be a monster. Puzzled, the young man asked if he really looked like a rabbit. Isabelle thought she had offended the young lad. She said he looked like a rabbit in her eyes. They were having a nice conversation and decided to go out to dinner. Professor Oz was a bit puzzled, as he couldn't believe so many students had come to see him. He almost cried in front of the audience, out of happiness. But looking at the prince, he understood why they had all come to him. But still, he was very happy. The young prince looked for Isabelle with his gaze. He couldn't figure out where she'd gone. A young lady came up to him and said she had come to see him and about the party they had talked about last time. The prince was confused. The girl said they wanted to organize a party together. The prince confusedly recalled the past conversation and said he remembered everything. But his attention was fixed on Isabelle, who was talking to Esar. Isabelle and Esar were taking a walk. The young man asked why Isabelle wasn't going to dinner. The young princess looked at him and said that today's topic they had in lecture was not an easy one, and she needed to consolidate the material. He looked at her and asked if she wanted him to help her. Young Isabelle drew the spell and the runes. With a frightened look, she decided to proceed with her task. She sincerely wanted to succeed this time, but unfortunately failure awaited her. Isabelle looked at her friend from the sidelines and realized that he would have accomplished such a task in no time. She realized this after they met, as he was the son of a great enchanter. Like the prince, everyone knew him at the academy. He had a talent for magic, so he couldn't understand why the girl had such a hard time with magic. When the young man said he could help the girl, Isabelle hesitated a bit as she knew he disliked magic. Esar looked at her and wondered what made her think that. Isabelle knew that the professor loved magic so much that he used it in his household, going so far as to flip through pages with magic, and Isabelle had never seen the young man apply it, even in everyday trivialities. And besides, sometimes in magic class, he had a very intimidating face. Isabelle looked at him and said she wouldn't want to force a man to do something he didn't like. The young man was surprised at this answer and said that he would just look from the outside in that case, and you would not help her. Isabelle looked at him. The sight of him was confusing her. She didn't understand why he wasn't just going to sleep in his room, instead choosing to sleep under the tree. She knew it was already chilly outside. She decided to brush her thoughts away and not think about it. She needed to focus. She knew she had to try a few more times and throw all thoughts away. Looking at the young boy, everyone marveled at the fact that he was able to see mana. People were confused that at such a young age, he was subject to any kind of magic. They thought he was a monster. The young man went to his father and said that he did not want to be a warlock. After all, he had heard about himself from other people's mouths. The warlock was shocked. He didn't understand why the mood had suddenly changed. The man frantically wanted to know what the young man could become then. The warlock assured him that the young man would still become a mage no matter what. His own mother was always on his side. She supported him in every way possible and told him that he should do what he liked. Esar woke up and didn't realize how long he had slept. He saw that he was covered by his jacket and Isabelle was sitting beside him. He was surprised she was still sitting next to him. Isabelle said she really wanted to show him something when he woke up. Young Isabelle looked at her friend and said that she had finally managed to get a magic contract. The young man was surprised and asked how she did it. Isabelle looked at the rabbit confusedly and said that she herself didn't understand how it had come about. She simply asked him if he wanted to contract with her. The young man was very surprised, as he knew that the magic contract that Isabelle used helps to appropriate summoned living beings. It was simply magic that only required a one-way application of mana. The young man knew that the girl couldn't sense mana. The young man hastily stood up, handed her the jacket and told her to take it back. Isabelle said they already needed to leave and thanked him for being there for her. Esar looked at the rabbit and asked the young girl if she had already given it a name. Isabelle hesitated a bit and said she hadn't thought of it yet. He looked at her and asked if she considered a rabbit for a pet. The last step in making a magical contract was naming the creature. It was a kind of agreement binding the two. The young man said that if you don't name the creature, it might just run away. Young Isabelle was surprised and confused. She didn't know what she could call her new friend. Esar didn't understand why he had to teach her everything. Isabelle thought for a moment and said she was calling the rabbit Moo. The young man marveled. So knew it was short for his last name. Isabelle said he became her first friend at the academy, and the bunny was her first called baby. The young lady asked in a trembling voice if he liked the bunny's name or not. She said if he didn't like it, she could pick another name. The young man said she could keep that name for the baby. Isabelle looked at the young man and the rabbit for a long time. The more she looked at them, the more she saw the similarities between them. The professor said in a cheerful voice that it was already 2 whole months since the beginning of the semester. He said with a smile that there is a freshman party next week and academic club recruitment is opening up. The professor said they could look at the bulletin board in the lobby to learn more information. The young princess looked at the bulletin board with trepidation. She looked at all the jobs. There was a gardening club, soothsayers and divination, needlework, theology, and academic papers. There was a lot going on. The girl was a little confused as she didn't know where to go. The young men sat on the steps. Isabelle said that at the freshman welcome party, each club recruits new members. She wanted to know which one would suit her better. The young man looked at her and asked her if she necessarily had to choose which club to go to. The princess said it's a prerequisite to get extra points. Esar looked at her in bewilderment. He didn't know what she was talking about. Isabelle knew that if there had been a self-taught club she would have attended right away, but it was a pity there was no such thing. Esar looked at her and asked what about the magic club. Isabelle was a little surprised, as she hadn't seen one on the bulletin board. The young man said that such a club could only be accessed by recommendation, and if she wanted to go there, he could help her. The princess was surprised and asked the young man if he was a member of this club. The young man said that the head of the magic club came to him before he entered the academy and suggested that he join them. He looked at her with a smile and told her that if she wanted, he would be the first to join the club and recommend her afterward. The girl was astonished, for she knew that the young man did not want to join the club. Isabelle looked at him and said she didn't want to make him do anything he didn't want to do. She thanked him for the offer and said she would still think about which club she should join. The young man was shocked, because around him there were always people who did what they wanted just to achieve their goal. There were among them those who, to satisfy their thirst for research, were willing to sacrifice even their humanity. But the girl refused his help every time, and so the young man was perplexed. The young wizard looked at the young princess and said that she was truly a unique person. The young students saw the prince and began to whisper. They said he was as beautiful as ever. The academy gives extra points for club activities, so joining and participating in a club is almost essential. The young prince was sure that Isabelle was sure to choose some club for herself. Still, he wanted to know where she would join. He knew the girl had a habit of biting her lip when she was concentrating on something. He knew that she often read a book by the fountain in the garden and the possibility of it being a book club. Also, the prince knew she was into needlework. The young prince saw that the girl was having trouble with her form. Later, classmates noticed that the girl had a rabbit embroidered on her skirt. They said it was very nice. Isabelle looked at them and said she just wanted to try stitching herself, as she really likes to do needlework. The prince was shocked and didn't understand why she would do such a trifling thing. Only then did he realize that the girl was a poor foreigner, a student who doesn't even have another copy of the form. He was sure that because of the scholarship, she was obsessed with her studies. A few days passed and there was a welcome party for first-timers. Everyone met their family members and were very excited about the moment. The young princess was alone in a crowd of complete strangers. She thought it would be better for her to go to the library, as it was much quieter there than the noisy crowd. The young princess sat alone in the library, along with her rabbit. She knew she needed to write her brother a letter. Suddenly she heard an incomprehensible sound. There was a cute little girl sitting at the next desk. She was writing something, but it wasn't working. Young Isabelle didn't even notice that someone was sitting next to her. She thought that on a day like this, no one but her would come to the library. She noticed her pretty tie thought she was a senior. The girl turned to young Isabelle. She asked her to hold still for just 1 minute. Young Isabelle was puzzled but agreed to her demands. The girl was overjoyed and pleased, shouting that she had made it and could do it. She walked over to Isabelle and thanked her, as she was able to finish her skit because of her. The young black-haired girl introduced herself and said her name was Joy, and thanked Isabelle again. The young princess also introduced her new acquaintance. Joy was surprised and asked her if she was the girl who got in with the highest score in the academy. The girl said she was actually just writing a play about a princess. Joy said as soon as their gazes met, and it felt like she'd known all her life. Isabelle, the young princess, looked at Joy with a puzzled look. To clear the air, Joy asked Isabelle if she had decided which club to join. Isabelle said she hadn't decided yet, but was just thinking about it. Joy asked if she had any options in mind. The young princess said that at the moment she was thinking of a needlework club or a book club, since she didn't think she could get into the magic club. Joy heard everything Isabelle was saying and asked her if she wanted to pick a theater arts club. Isabelle pondered her words, but she also said she had never played before and didn't know what to do. She didn't think it would be much use in class. Joy reassured her and told her that she had nothing to worry about, as it was very simple. Since theater club doesn't involve just pure play, they prepared sets, costumes, props, and wrote scripts. Joy said it is a very entertaining club, and it is a lot of fun to be there as you can do different chores. But above all, the advantage of the Theater Arts Club is that you can easily get extra points there, no matter what kind of work you do. Isabelle was pacing with her friend, and he looked at her and asked her perplexedly if she had decided to join the theater club. The young lady said with a smile that she had decided to enroll there after all. Prince said he joined the needlework club because he developed an interest in something he hadn't done before. The prince was sure that this kind of activity was closely intertwined with everyday life, whether it was embroidery or making clothes. He thought that as emperor he would benefit from such knowledge. Esar knew he would now have a reason to taunt the prince, as he knew where the young princess had entered. Isabelle looked at her friend and asked why with her and not her family. She knew that the academy was heavily guarded and outsiders were strictly forbidden to enter here, as there was a dormitory on the grounds and the academy doors were rarely opened. But days like this, students' families might come without much invitation, so she thought Esar's relatives would too. The young man frustratedly replied that no one had come to see him because his father hated him, and his mother was dead. The girl was upset after saying that and apologized to the young man. Esar said it was fine, and it would be convenient for both of them to know each other's information ahead of time, since they were friends after all. He looked at her and said with a smile that if she didn't have any plans, they could take a walk together. Young Isabelle apologized to her friend, but said she couldn't go because she had a lecture coming up and needed to go to the auditorium. Esar was surprised since he knew they didn't have class today. Isabelle said one of the academy graduates came to teach a class today, and on the bulletin board were the names of students who absolutely had to come, since it was kind of an extra class. Esar was surprised. He didn't understand what extra classes there could be for a top freshman. Isabelle looked at him and said it was probably because she was an international student. The girl looked at the young man and asked if he wanted to go with her. Esar was at a loss, but he thought he could mess with the prince that way and told her he would go with her. There was a slightly depressed atmosphere in the audience. Isabelle looked at everyone and realized that there were no people in the audience who came from famous families. A 26th graduate of the academy came into the auditorium and said that he would give them a lecture. Isabelle was frantically frightened and surprised as the man was from her past life. It was Count Valen, her husband. The man greeted everyone with a smile. The girl looked at the man with frightened eyes and realized that the reason she had entered the academy was right in front of her. The Count looked at all the students and said that he was teaching the classes and knew how difficult their way of learning was, and since he was much older than them, he wanted to help them a little in their learning since they were in the same empire. Isabelle expected that at least once they would definitely meet, but she didn't think it would happen so spontaneously. The Count walked around the classroom and handed out knowledge test sheets. He approached one young lady and gave her a sheet with the assignment, and he asked if she could read the assignment out loud for all to hear. The girl in a trembling voice began to read the information. The young girl read the information, her voice trembling, and she stammered a bit. The Count, with impatience in his voice, corrected the young lady. He snatched the sheet from her hands with anger as he could no longer tolerate the way she read. He said that in the past one had to pass a very difficult exam to enter the academy, as the reputation was high and people with low knowledge could not get into the academy. The Count shouted that the academy was currently accepting just about anyone. He couldn't believe that there were students who couldn't read properly. Isabelle sat and listened to his statement. She thought back to the day she couldn't read the information. The Count was furiously yelling that he was disappointed in her and all the students. He said such a reading was an embarrassment, both to him and to everyone. The Count walked around the auditorium and looked disdainfully at everyone present. He asked with anger in his voice if anyone could read normally the information he was giving. Esar looked at him, and he had an incipient hatred towards the Count. He had planned to just watch, but given the man's tone, he wanted to flip the entire audience off. Unexpectedly, Isabelle raised her hand and said she wanted to read the information. Isabelle read the information on the sheet without a hitch or mistake. The Count stared at her and thought that a young person from an aristocratic family had wandered into the academy by mistake. But apparently that wasn't the case. The young lady read the text and thought a bit. The Count asked her if it was hard for her to read. But Isabelle found an error in the text and asked again if she thought correctly. Isabelle pointed out a specific error in the dates. The Count looked at her with anger and didn't understand how an ordinary student could know such information. He said with anger in his voice that she was quite erudite. The Count knew that even among the nobility, it was rare to find people who knew the true history. He grinned and looked at her from asking her what her name was. Isabelle looked up at him with all her courage and introduced herself. She was determined not to give up and defeat him whatever it cost her. The Count looked at her and realized that it was a princess from the Rune Kingdom. The Kingdom of Rune was a small island nation, an area even smaller than its possessions were, and after the kingdom lost in an unequal war, it was annexed to the empire. And when negotiations to marry the princess of the Kingdom of Rune ceased, the Count was very pleased he didn't even think he could meet her at the academy. The Count looked at the young girl with disdain and knew that she came from a backwater kingdom. He knew the girl spent a good deal of time reading books, but digging a little deeper would reveal her rustic nature. He looked at her disdainfully and asked a few questions. The girl answered all his questions, but the Count saw some flaws in her answers and decided to correct her. The girl faltered, for she knew the Count was wrong, and a moment later she proved him wrong. He was shocked that he had made an oversight. Esar watched the whole thing from the sidelines and thought with a smile that the Count had made a fool of himself. The Count saw that the young girl really knew a lot of things, and he decided to bombard her with questions. But the young lady was not confused and gave an answer to every question he asked. The Count was furiously angry at the young, excellent student and did not understand how she could know so much. Isabelle looked at him and said that the academy provides equal learning opportunities regardless of a student's status or background. So, through this opportunity, she and other kids can learn a lot. Isabelle looked at the Count and said that it seems that things were very different during his time at the academy. The Count was shocked and very angry that he had lost to the young princess. He said he took up too much of the students' time and said goodbye to them. He left the auditorium immediately. A young girl approached Isabelle. She introduced herself as Miss Roth. The girl thanked Isabelle for what she had done today at the lecture. The girl said that everyone had already noticed that she was a commoner, so she did not have a last name, only a first name. Nevertheless, she put a lot of effort into getting into the academy. But in cases like this, she didn't know how to act. After telling her story, the girl once again thanked Isabelle for everything that was going on in the classroom and for her help. Esar saw his friend and called out to her. He knew it was like a ray of light was coming from her. And looking at her, he realized that the girl didn't need anyone else's help. He said with a smile that he didn't want anything and said goodbye to her. One of the women who worked at the academy met Isabelle and told her that she had a letter, and she said that the young lady was coming back very late and one day she might get in trouble. Isabelle sat and read the letter carefully. Her brother had written to her. He wrote that he was very happy that she was doing well. He also talked about his workouts. He asked her if she would come to the training base during the summer vacation, as he frantically wanted to prepare for their meeting and was looking forward to meeting her. He also wrote that if she had any difficulties or worries, he would definitely listen to them and help her with everything. Isabelle read the letter and was very glad that her brother was doing well. She missed him very much and wanted to meet him soon. She wanted to share everything that was on her mind. Isabelle felt a little lonely as she watched the other families. But after reading the letter, she felt harmony and calmness in her soul, because she knew that regardless of the distance, their hearts were united. She was looking forward to the vacation and their meeting. The next day, young Isabelle woke up earlier than usual. She found through the corridors of the academy and hummed a cheerful song. She knew she had a world history class in the afternoon, so she wanted to prepare in advance. Unexpectedly, the prince came out of his office into the hallway. He said hello to her. The prince looked at her and asked if she always came so early to class. The princess said he also came early today. He told the prince with a smile that he just woke up early and decided to prepare for class in advance. Isabelle kept addressing the prince as you. The young man was very upset. He didn't want her to stop treating him like that. Wherever the prince went, people tried to talk to him, so he didn't know where best to start talking to the man in front of him. He had never had to ask his interlocutor anything, and especially he had never had to ask what his interlocutor was thinking, since he had never been interested in it before. However, looking at the young girl, he has different problems. He knew that from the beginning she wasn't interested in status or his power and money. Isabelle looked at the prince and asked if nothing had bothered him in the last few days. The young man hesitated, not knowing what to answer. He didn't understand why she was suddenly asking such a thing. He hoped she was worried about him. He looked at her and said he was fine and wanted to know why it was asking that. Isabelle missed her eyes and said that she had always thought that the man occupying the seat of Prince of the Empire was never easy. The prince looked not, and said that she was also the princess of her kingdom, and she also duly realized the weight of power. He asked her with a smile, and wondered if that was why she was asking him. He was glad they had that in common. He also thanked her for her concern. He said with a smile that he was fine now and there were no difficulties. Isabelle looked at him and wondered who he cared about. The prince was surprised by such a question. He didn't understand what she meant by her question. He wanted to give her an answer to her question, but suddenly some classmates came into the classroom. He said in a rush that he didn't think there was such a person he could care about. The princess looked at the prince and thanked him for the early conversation. She said that thanks to him, she had fun. He answered her with a smile that he was having a lot of fun, too. He hoped they would soon have time for a normal conversation again. Looking at her, he didn't understand why she was asking him such questions. He wanted to know what she was thinking right now. Isabelle was very glad that the other students came up to them, as the current Chris was straightforward and soft like a prince from a fairy tale, but the prince she had seen before was a very different person. Looking at the young guys, she realized that their friendship was real, since before she thought their friendship was only acting. But now, Isabelle realized that this was not true at all, but also Isabelle was puzzled at what could have changed the principal so much in the future. Besides, she believed there was someone who was bothering him after all. Isabelle knew that if she could get close to him, she would surely find out the reason why he had changed so much. Her thoughts were interrupted by the first class of the afternoon, namely World History in World History. There was a lot of information, so Isabelle knew she had to consolidate everything thoroughly. The teacher was telling the history of the continent, specifically that the world tree is at the center of the continent. There are many kingdoms around this tree, and among all of them, only Eterenti has the right to be called an empire, to which the tree has belonged to this day. In order to preserve the great right, the empire is making great efforts for the prosperity of the country. The prosperity of the country is exemplified by the war that began 3 years ago and continues to this day. Through war, the empire has annexed other kingdoms. The young girl knew that the immortality of the empire meant the destruction of other countries. The instructor said that many kingdoms, including the kingdom of Rune instead of full submission, were given the right to education in the empire, technology, and a host of other privileges. Isabelle felt the piercing stares of the students, who on normal days were not interested in her. She knew it would be over soon, and she needed to be patient a little longer. The prince decided to stand up for his young friend. He told the professor that there were international students in their class. Young Isabelle was surprised, as this was the first time she felt all the prices met the prince's gaze. In the next class, Professor Oz gave all the information about magic reagents and asked them to prepare one of the magic reagents on their own by next week. The students were puzzled, but the professor said they wouldn't even need mana to make it, and if the recipe and ingredients were correct and in the right proportions. The professor said they could find the method of making it in textbooks or in the library, and they could find the ingredients in the lab or in the parish magic garden. He also added that the resulting product will affect their final score. Esar came to class. The professor was perplexed. He didn't understand why the young man had come to their class. Esar looked at him and said that he had come to hear the lesson even if he was late. Esar and Isabelle were sitting around discussing the past class. Isabelle said she was going to start the assignment today. She looked at the young man and asked what the best recipe was. The young man stared intently at his friend and couldn't get enough of her, as the color of her mana was very unique and mesmerizing. It made it hard for him to take his eyes off her. He wanted to know more about her. The young man did not understand how the girl managed to get the attention of the narcissistic prince right after entering the academy. He knew that absolutely all the magics around him possessed exclusively blue mana. But it was in the girl that she differed, despite her complete lack of experience and the knowledge of magic the girl was heavily studying. Esar looked up at the sky, taking his gaze away from his friend, and said that there are so many types of magic reagents as well as types in magic. The young man asked Isabelle if she had had any difficulties or worries lately. Isabelle was very much surprised at such a question, for the same question she had asked the prince. Isabelle looked at her friend and said that she had no worries and was fine. She wondered why he suddenly wondered that. The young man looked at her and said with a smile that it had just occurred to him, and he decided to ask her. Isabelle looked at him and asked if there was something that was bothering him or someone. Esar was shocked. He looked at her perplexed and asked if she really wasn't worried. Isabelle looked at him and said that she was worried about him, as he had never had much interest in classes, but had not been seen in class at all lately. She knew that at this rate he could fail the exam, and after that he would face expulsion. Isabelle was upset by his words. She said he didn't care, but she would be very sad if he was expelled. The young man was surprised. He hadn't expected such an answer from her. The man was frantically yelling at the boy as he was very worried about him. He shouted that there were many wizards looking for him all this time. He knew that no matter how talented the boy was, he shouldn't have abused the concealment magic. He knew that the wizards feared him because of his outstanding talent, and his father was constantly angry with him instead of worrying about him as his child. Only one mother was frantically crying and worrying about her son. She didn't understand what motivated him to hide. Isabelle said that she would be very homesick without him, for he was the first friend she had met at the academy. Esar realized that he had to try harder to avoid being expelled from the academy. The professor found the young boy and looked at him and said he had been looking for him for a long time. He had something he wanted to tell him and asked him for some time. Esar knew there were several reasons why the professor wanted to talk to him. The first was to talk about his grades, and the second related to his father. Esar said he was busy, since he didn't really want to talk to the professor, but the professor was serious and said he was aware that the young man had no business being there. The professor shouted back to him that his conversation had to do with Isabelle. They went to the lab to talk in peace and quiet. Esar told me it was very stuffy in the lab, but the professor thought otherwise. The professor said he felt as if it was only yesterday that everyone was preparing for the academy entrance exams, and so much time had already passed. He thought that time was flying very fast. The young man couldn't stand it and told the professor that he didn't need to beat around the bush and asked him to get to the heart of the conversation. He didn't want a long conversation and hoped to leave the professor soon. The professor looked at the young man and said that he could feel a huge wave of mana recently, and quite possibly its source was Miss Isabelle. Esar looked at the professor and said that he was aware of everything and had recently been able to see for himself that there was a large flow of mana coming from the girl. The professor was surprised. Before the academy's entrance ceremony, Esar paid Oz a surprise visit. He felt a strong wave of mana from the rune realm. He could not accurately recognize the identity of the owner, but it was obvious that the source was in the royal castle. Therefore, the young man asked the professor to personally go to the kingdom and check everything, as Esar himself was very busy preparing for the exams. However, the professor knew that there was no way a wizard could have existed in that place, so he found it hard to believe what he had heard. Mana is the source of all magic. She is the energizing energy that comes from the tree at the center of the empire, and, as everyone believes, its area of operation does not cross the sea. Hence, mana can't exist on an island nation, and a wizard there can't come from nowhere. The Rune Kingdom was too far away from the tree, and besides, it was completely surrounded by the sea. When the professor heard the information from the prospective student, he could not believe him all that was said. The professor didn't really believe the young man's words. Esar said he agreed to join the academy, so much so that the professor needed to honor his small request. From that day the professor saw that the young gentleman's heart, in which winter had always stood, had thawed a little. The professor told Esar that even though Isabelle has a large amount of mana, it doesn't affect her in any way. A mana medka is a phenomenon that represents a mark on the human body when resonating with a tree. The most common effect is to change the color of the nails to blue. so most wizards have nails of such an unusual shade, but the girl doesn't have any blue nails or any markings. The young man looked at the professor and said it was because she had red mana. The professor was shocked, as such a phenomenon had long since disappeared. The professor knew that they needed to study such an unusual phenomenon anyway. The professor asked Esar if his father knew. Esar looked at him and said he hadn't told him anything. Professor Oz said he would try to find some information on his own, and asked the young man to do his homework while he did his research. In the blink of an eye, Esar was transported to the young princess. He asked what she was busy doing. The girl said she was looking for regent materials. The young man said with a smile that she needed to get some rest and not worry about searching. The professor looked out of the window at the young men. He was very happy that the boy had made a good friend. He was happy for him and wished his heart would melt and not be wrapped in cold again. After all, it had been winter for a long time. The professor hoped the boy's heart would spring. Isabelle sat in the library with her new friend. The black-haired girl was shocked as young Isabelle picked up a lot of books. Isabelle said she needed to make a magic reagent by the end of next week. Lately, the girl had been coming to the library almost every day and studying to keep her grades high. Because of this, she would occasionally run into Joy, who would come in to write scripts. Joy asked Isabelle if she was having a hard time and if she was okay. The princess said she was fine. Of course, she had a hard time disengaging from Esar, as he was constantly following her around and calling her to go for a walk or to eat and telling her that she still had plenty of time. Joy looked at her young friend and noticed that she looked very tired. She didn't understand what kind of a subject it was, one after which one had to torture oneself like that. Isabelle said it was just applied magic. Joy was shocked. She knew the subject was being taught by Professor Oz. Isabelle was puzzled and didn't understand what was going on. Her reaction to what she heard was explosive. Suddenly, a young man came up to them and said that no noise was allowed in the library. He looked at Isabelle and said that it looked like this was the student who wanted to join their club. Joy introduced Isabelle and also introduced Kane, saying that he was also a member of the theater club and he was also a childhood friend of Joy's. Isabelle knew that the young man came from the influential family of the Minister of the Empire. Joy asked her friend to stay with Isabelle for a while, since she needed to interview one more candidate. Isabelle was shocked. Joy calmed her down and told her she'd be back quickly. The young man looked at Isabelle and said that according to Joy, the girl is the first candidate Joy wants to drag into the club herself. Isabelle eyed her young man. He looked cold and harsh to the will, but still she thought he was a good man. The girl felt like she and Joy were complete opposites. The young man looked at the stack of books beside Isabelle and said that he and Joy had attended Professor Oz's first-year class together. Isabelle was genuinely surprised that they were attending the professor's lectures, since she had heard that the subject was not very popular. Kane knew that his girlfriend Joy was unrequitedly in love with Professor Oz. Esar watched young Isabelle gather ingredients for her project. He was very bored. The girl told him to wait a little longer as she only had one more ingredient to find. Kane told his friend Isabelle's secret. He didn't understand why he had told such an intimate thing to a student he was seeing for the first time in his life. Isabelle didn't want to intrude on other students' personal lives. She asked the young man in all seriousness to help her. She asked which reagent the two of them had chosen for their first assignment, since there were so many, and she was still agonizing over the choice. The young man was surprised and asked her again if he understood correctly that she wanted to know what kind of reagent they had created. Isabelle said that such information would help her make up her mind. The young man said he made a transformation reagent that could change appearance for half a day, and his girlfriend created a reagent with pheromones. The reagent made the opposite sex fall in love with the wearer, and Joy called it a love potion. Young Isabelle was in shock. Since I knew that the transformation reagent is considered to be very difficult to make and belongs to a high-end product, she didn't understand how the young man had managed to stretch the duration of the effect over half a day instead of a couple hours. Kane looked at her and said he could share tips in crafting that weren't in the book. Isabelle was very pleased and delighted at the suggestion. She thanked sincerely for such an offer, but the girl thought it would be better if she did everything herself from the beginning. She felt that if she relied too much on others, Her personal progress would fade altogether. The young man smiled and said that now he understood why Joy liked the girl so much. Young Isabelle looked at her friend and said she was very glad she had joined the theater club specifically, since through it all, she charged in with a little help. Esar was puzzled. He was angry that she was showing with her whole appearance that she didn't care about him. He knew some senior in the theater club had helped her. He looked at her and said that it turns out that she had the advice that the senior had given her written on a piece of paper. He wanted to see what it said. He reached for the leaf. Isabelle shouted that such behavior was not befitting a gentleman. She said there was no advice, and she only had her personal notes written down on a piece of paper. So much so that she wouldn't want to show them. Isabelle noticed that her friend was very stubborn. She asked what kind of reagent he chose. Esar looked at her and said he'd rather join the theater club than do such a stupid assignment. Isabelle realized that Esar wasn't paying the slightest attention to anything he wasn't interested in. Nevertheless, she found him to be a very kind and caring friend, and she would very much like to attend the academy with him in the future. However, if this continues, he could be expelled. Isabelle looked at him and said that even if she had asked, he wouldn't have joined the theater club. She really wanted them to study together in the future. She didn't know what she could do for him. The prince approached them. He was shocked at what he heard. "Since I didn't expect Isabelle to join the theater club." Isabelle noticed that something was wrong with him and asked casually if he had cut himself. Cross said he was fine and had just recently joined the needlework club. Esar looked at the prince and asked why he had come to them. The prince hesitated a little, for he had only come to them because he had heard Isabelle's voice. He said he was here to do his homework. Isabelle was overjoyed and said they could study together. Esar was in no mood to engage with them. He said that if they so desired, they could do the assignment as a couple. Isabelle decided to be sneaky, as she didn't want the young man to fail and get kicked out. She said she would owe one wish to whoever got the highest score on their assignment. But everything has to be within reason. The prince looked at her and said with a smile that he was thinking about the fact that he needed to practice in other areas besides swordsmanship. But such an offer was very tempting to him. Esar looked at his friend and said contentedly, "Interesting suggestions," and he also agreed. Seeing their reactions, Isabelle thought that she would soon regret such a suggestion. Kane came over to Joy and said her script from yesterday was pretty good, and he also said he brought a snack. Joy was overjoyed as she was a little hungry. The young man asked his friend how her interview yesterday went. Joy said another person came to see her who decided to join just because of him. The young man apologized. Joy said he had no need to apologize and asked what he and Isabelle had talked about yesterday. Since she left the two of them, the young man said that Professor Oz had given them the same assignment with the reagents that they had once had, and that was what they talked about all the time. Joy realized that Isabelle would be making a transformation reagent. She was sure her friend had given her some advice. Kane said he offered to give Isabelle some advice, but she replied that she wanted to run her own errand. Joy, with a smile, said that the girl easily showed honest and proper traits. Actually, her character and behavior pleased Joy. The young man said that the girl had shown an interest in a love potion, a potion Joy had once made. Joy was shocked at what she heard. A father brought his son to meet the prince. The young boy faltered. The prince looked at him and said that shyness was not a sin, and held out his hand and introduced himself. The prince said with a smile that Mr. Dalf had told him a great deal about him, and he was very glad to make his acquaintance. Esar looked at the young prince with contempt and said that he didn't like liars like the prince. The prince was shocked at such a statement. Esar sat in a tree and thought about everything. He knew his next class was practical magic, so he could take a little nap. The prince came to the tree where the young man was lying and said that he knew the man was awake, so much so that he asked him to come down for a little while. Esar did not understand why the prince was not in class. Chris said there's a break going on right now, so they can talk. Prince looked at his friend and said he was aware that he didn't care about classes, but he didn't understand why. He didn't know the call schedule. Esar was in no mood to listen to the prince's lectures, and told him to be quicker to say why he had come, as he had to observe his afternoon nap time. The prince knew that this disrespectful attitude had been there since he was a child, and he hasn't changed a bit after all this time. Chris knew he just had to be patient, for if someone else had been in the young man's shoes, he would have been taken into custody long ago. But if Esar is standing in front of him, it's a different story. Prince and Esar had been close friends since childhood, thanks to their father's long friendship, and he didn't really want to fight and blame a friend he had known for a long time. In addition, Esar is a member of the Tower of Mages, so treating it carelessly would simply be unwise. After all, only wizards who have participated in every war gather in the Mage Tower. The Tower Mages were contributing a lot,